My stepdad thought the secret died with my mother. Then his lawyer read the letter out loud. My name is Samantha. I was 8 years old when my mother married Gerald, a mid-level executive at a logistics company who traveled frequently for work but always returned with a kind of restless energy that filled our small house whenever he was home. My biological father had died in a car accident when I was 5, a loss so early in my life that my memories of him exist mostly as fragments, the smell of his aftershave, the particular way he used to hum while driving. Gerald entered our lives about 2 years later, and for a while his presence felt like a genuine kindness extended toward a mother and daughter who'd been struggling quietly on their own. Gerald never had children of his own, a fact he mentioned occasionally in those early years, always framed as though it made him more available, more devoted to being present for me specifically, since he had no competing obligations elsewhere. For a few years that framing seemed to hold true. He attended school functions when his travel schedule allowed, helped with homework some evenings, built what felt at the time like a reasonably steady relationship between a stepfather and a young stepdaughter still processing significant early loss. The shift began so gradually I couldn't identify its exact starting point, only a slow accumulation of distance that grew more pronounced as I moved through my early teenage years. Gerald's business trips grew longer and more frequent, sometimes stretching 2 or 3 weeks at a time, and even when he was home he seemed increasingly preoccupied, distracted by phone calls he'd take in another room, conversations he never fully explained when he returned to the dinner table afterward. My mother, working full-time as a hospital administrator, tried to fill the growing gaps in Gerald's presence as best she could, but I noticed, even as a young teenager, a particular tension that seemed to settle over her whenever Gerald's travel schedule came up in conversation, a tightness around her eyes she tried, not always successfully, to hide from me. When I asked her directly once around age 14 whether something was wrong between them, she reassured me quickly that everything was fine, that his job simply required unusual amounts of travel, an explanation I accepted at the time without much further questioning. I remember one particular incident from around that time, my 15th birthday, when Gerald had promised weeks in advance that he'd be home for the small dinner my mother was planning, only to call that same afternoon explaining that a client meeting had run long and he wouldn't make it back until well after the celebration had ended. My mother tried to keep the evening light for my sake, but I remember noticing even then how her hands seemed to shake slightly while she lit the candles on the cake, a detail that meant little to me at the time but that I've thought about often in the years since, wondering now whether that particular disappointment landed differently for her, carrying knowledge about Gerald's absence that went far deeper than a missed client dinner. By the time I reached high school, Gerald's emotional distance from me had become the defining feature of our relationship. A coolness that never crossed into outright unkindness but that left me feeling, increasingly, like a polite houseguest in my own home rather than a genuinely valued member of the family. He attended my high school graduation, technically present, but spent much of the reception afterward on his phone, stepping outside twice for calls he described only as work-related. When he returned, calls I now suspect, looking back with the knowledge I eventually gained, may have had nothing to do with work at all. I left for college at 18, relieved in some ways to finally build a life somewhat separate from Gerald's increasingly puzzling distance, though genuinely confused about what exactly had caused the shift I'd witnessed throughout my teenage years. I studied graphic design, built a career over the following decade at a mid-sized advertising agency, eventually specializing in brand identity work that let me combine genuine creative satisfaction with steady, reliable income. Throughout those years, my relationship with Gerald remained polite but distant, holiday visits and occasional phone calls that never developed into anything warmer, a pattern that felt, by that point, simply like the unremarkable shape our relationship had always taken. My mother remained the emotional center of our small family, and I maintained a close, warm relationship with her throughout my 20s and early 30s, talking on the phone most weeks, visiting regularly despite the 3-hour drive between our respective cities. My mother's health began declining significantly about 4 years ago, a difficult decline from a serious illness that ultimately took her life a little over 3 years ago now. I moved back closer to home during the final months of her illness, spending as much time as possible at her bedside, conversations that grew increasingly precious as her condition worsened. I noticed during those final months an unusual gentleness in how she spoke about Gerald, a carefulness that struck me as slightly odd given the emotional distance I'd witnessed developing between them over the years, though I chalked it up at the time to the particular softening that sometimes comes with facing mortality directly. Her passing was devastating, and in the years since, my relationship with Gerald settled into an even more distant pattern than before. Brief holiday calls that felt increasingly obligatory on both sides. A relationship maintained more out of habit than genuine connection. I met my partner Ethan about 2 years after my mother's death, a graphic novelist whose quiet, steady presence offered exactly the kind of consistency I hadn't fully realized I'd been missing throughout my adult relationships up to that point. We met at a small gallery opening a mutual friend had organized, bonding immediately over a shared appreciation for a particular illustrator neither of us expected the other to know. A small, ordinary coincidence that grew over the following months into the most stable, genuinely present relationship I'd ever built with anyone. Gerald met Ethan exactly once at a brief holiday gathering, an interaction so unremarkable that I barely remember any specific details from it now. Aside from a vague sense that Gerald seemed distracted throughout most of the evening, checking his phone repeatedly in a habit that, by that point, felt entirely unremarkable given years of similar behavior. About 5 months ago, I received a call from an attorney's office informing me that my mother had left a sealed letter with her estate attorney years earlier, one she'd specifically instructed be read aloud to both Gerald and me together in person, once certain conditions outlined in her estate planning documents had been satisfied. I hadn't known such a letter existed. When I called Gerald to ask whether he'd received similar notification, his voice carried an unusual, immediate tension that struck me as different from his typical composed, if distant, demeanor. We met at the attorney's office on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, the first time Gerald and I had been alone together in a room since my mother's funeral. The attorney, a thoughtful older man named Mr. Alvarez who explained he'd worked with my mother privately for several years without either Gerald or me knowing the specifics, opened a sealed envelope and began reading my mother's words aloud, her handwriting apparently included alongside a typed version for clarity, the same careful, deliberate style I recognized immediately from years of birthday cards and handwritten notes she'd left me throughout my life. My mother's letter opened warmly, expressions of love for both Gerald and me that had us both visibly emotional within the first few lines. But the letter's true purpose emerged gradually as Mr. Alvarez continued reading, revealing a truth my mother had apparently discovered roughly 15 years earlier, one she'd chosen to carry silently for the remainder of her life, revealing it only now years after her own passing, once enough time had elapsed for certain deeply personal matters to be approached with the distance and clarity she'd apparently felt neither Gerald nor I would have during her lifetime. The letter explained that 15 years earlier, during a period when Gerald's business travel had increased noticeably, my mother had discovered, through a combination of unexpected circumstances and careful, quiet investigation of her own, that Gerald had a son from a relationship that had occurred before he'd ever met my mother, a son named Marcus, born to a woman Gerald had been involved with briefly in his 20s, before establishing the career and life he'd eventually built with our family. Gerald, according to my mother's letter, had known about Marcus's existence the entire time but had chosen never to acknowledge or support him in any meaningful way, walking away from that responsibility entirely decades earlier, a fact he had never disclosed to my mother throughout their entire relationship and marriage. Sitting in that attorney's office, I watched Gerald's face transform through a sequence of emotions I'd genuinely never witnessed from him before, shock giving way rapidly to something that looked almost like relief mixed with dread, a stunned realization that the wife he'd successfully deceived for over 15 years of marriage had, in fact, uncovered the truth years earlier, choosing silence not out of ignorance but out of some deliberate, carefully considered strategy he'd never once suspected existed throughout all those years they'd continued building a life together. The letter continued, explaining that my mother had located Marcus herself, through careful research conducted quietly over several months roughly 15 years earlier, discovering that he'd grown up in genuinely difficult circumstances, his mother struggling significantly as a single parent without any financial support from Gerald throughout Marcus's entire childhood. Rather than immediately confronting Gerald or exposing the situation publicly, actions that would have almost certainly ended their marriage and disrupted the stability I depended on as a teenager still processing the earlier loss of my biological father, my mother had instead chosen a different path entirely, one she described in careful, deliberate detail throughout the remainder of the letter. She explained that she had quietly begun sending financial support to Marcus and his mother herself, using funds from a small inheritance she'd received from her own parents around that same time, kept entirely separate from the household's joint finances so that Gerald would never notice or question the withdrawals. She had continued this support consistently for years, helping fund Marcus's education, providing assistance during difficult periods his mother faced, building through letters and occasional phone calls she never mentioned to anyone in our household. A quiet, careful relationship with a stepson Gerald himself had never acknowledged or supported. My mother's letter explained that she had made peace with this choice, understanding it as an imperfect solution to a genuinely difficult situation, protecting both her marriage's stability during my formative teenage years and simultaneously, a child who deserved support regardless of his father's unwillingness to provide it. She wrote that she had always intended for the full truth to eventually surface, once circumstances allowed it to be approached without the immediate threat of destroying the family stability I'd depended on throughout my adolescence. The letter's final section revealed the true purpose behind this posthumous disclosure. My mother explained that Marcus, now an adult in his mid-30s, had no knowledge that his own biological father was aware of his existence, believing instead, based on what his mother had told him growing up, that Gerald had simply never known about the pregnancy at all. A protective lie his own mother had apparently maintained to spare him the deeper pain of understanding he'd been knowingly abandoned rather than simply unknown. My mother's letter provided Marcus's current contact information, along with a request, addressed specifically to me, that I consider reaching out to him if I felt comfortable doing so, understanding that he was, in every meaningful sense, my half-brother, one who deserved the choice of building a relationship with at least one member of the family that had, in various complicated ways, been aware of his existence throughout his entire life. After Mr. Alvarez finished reading, the room fell into a long, stunned silence. Gerald sat there for several minutes, visibly processing what he'd just heard, before finally speaking, his voice unsteady in a way I'd genuinely never witnessed from him before. He admitted, haltingly, that everything my mother's letter described was accurate, that he had indeed fathered a son decades earlier and chosen never to acknowledge or support him, a decision he described, without much attempt at justification, as one of the most cowardly choices of his entire life, one he'd apparently carried privately with growing shame, for over 3 decades without ever finding the courage to correct it. He turned to me at one point, visibly shaken, admitting that he'd always sensed on some level that my mother's occasional distance over the years might have stemmed from something specific, though he'd never had any concrete evidence and had, out of his own guilt and cowardice, never pressed the issue directly, preferring the comfortable ambiguity of not knowing for certain over the difficult reckoning that direct confrontation might have required of him. In the weeks following that meeting, I found myself processing an entirely new dimension to my own family history, one that had existed quietly in the background of my entire adolescence and young adulthood without me ever suspecting it. I reached out to Marcus myself about 3 weeks after the reading, an initial email that led to a lengthy, emotional phone call, and eventually, about 2 months later, an in-person meeting at a coffee shop roughly halfway between our respective cities. Meeting Marcus was one of the most surreal experiences of my adult life, recognizing small physical similarities between us, certain mannerisms that felt eerily familiar despite having grown up in entirely separate households, never knowing of each other's existence until that letter was finally read aloud. Marcus explained during that first meeting that he'd always wondered about his biological father, had occasionally searched for him online over the years without ever working up the courage to reach out directly, uncertain what kind of reception he might receive from a man he'd been told his entire life had simply never known he existed. I told him honestly, as gently as I could, the fuller truth my mother's letter had revealed, that Gerald had in fact known about him the entire time, choosing not to acknowledge or support him despite that knowledge. I watched Marcus absorb that information with a complicated mixture of validation and renewed hurt, admitting that some part of him had always suspected the truth might be more painful than the version he'd grown up believing, even as hearing it confirmed directly still landed with genuine visible weight. He told me during that same conversation that he'd built a genuinely good life for himself despite the absence, working as a high school science teacher, married with 2 young children of his own, a stability he'd clearly worked hard to construct without any help from the father who'd known about him the entire time. Ethan, who I'd brought along to that first meeting at Marcus's suggestion, later told me he'd watched Marcus and me across that coffee shop table and had been struck by how naturally we seemed to fall into an easy rhythm of conversation, despite having only just met, a resemblance that went beyond physical features into something harder to name. Gerald, once he learned I'd made contact with Marcus, reached out to me requesting information about how he might approach reconnecting, or more accurately, initially connecting with the son he'd spent over 3 decades avoiding entirely. I facilitated an initial, extremely cautious exchange of contact information between them, though I made clear to Gerald that whatever relationship developed or didn't develop between him and Marcus moving forward was entirely their own responsibility to navigate, not something I intended to manage or mediate on an ongoing basis. The initial meeting between Gerald and Marcus, which took place roughly 4 months after the letter was first read, was, according to what both later shared with me separately, genuinely difficult, marked by Gerald's halting attempts at explanation and apology, and Marcus's understandable guardedness after decades of believing himself entirely unknown to the man sitting across from him. The initial meeting between Gerald and Marcus, which took place roughly 4 months after the letter was first read, was, according to what both later shared with me separately, genuinely difficult, marked by Gerald's halting attempts at explanation and apology, and Marcus's understandable guardedness after decades of believing himself entirely unknown to the man sitting across from him. Marcus told me afterward that he'd rehearsed the conversation countless times in his head over the years he'd spent quietly wondering about his biological father, imagining various versions of a reunion that never quite matched the strange, careful formality of what actually unfolded that afternoon. Gerald, for his part, admitted to me privately that he'd nearly cancelled the meeting 3 separate times in the days leading up to it, terrified of facing in person the full weight of a decision he'd spent decades avoiding rather than confronting. There was no dramatic reconciliation in that first meeting, no easy resolution to 35 years of absence and unacknowledged responsibility. But there was, according to both of them, a genuine beginning, tentative and uncertain, toward something that might eventually become an actual relationship, built slowly on Marcus's terms and timeline rather than Gerald's convenience. In the months since, Gerald has begun providing Marcus with meaningful financial support, addressing decades of absence in the most concrete way currently available to him, alongside slow, careful attempts at building an actual personal relationship, dinners every few months, phone calls that Marcus has gradually become more willing to answer and engage with as trust develops incrementally over time. Marcus mentioned to me recently that his own children had begun asking questions about their grandfather, questions he's still figuring out how to answer honestly without burdening them with more of the complicated history than they're ready to understand at their young age. A challenge he says he approaches one small, careful conversation at a time. My own relationship with Marcus has grown considerably closer during this same period. Regular calls and visits that have added a genuinely unexpected, meaningful new relationship to my life during a period otherwise defined largely by grief over my mother's absence. My relationship with Gerald himself has shifted in complicated ways since that reading, not toward the warmth I might have once hoped for as a teenager confused by his growing distance, but toward something more honest than existed before, conversations that occasionally touch on his own shame and regret regarding Marcus, and gradually, an acknowledgement on his part of how his own guilt and secrecy likely contributed to the emotional distance he'd maintained from our entire family for years, without ever fully understanding or articulating its source, even to himself. My relationship with Gerald himself has shifted in complicated ways since that reading, not toward the warmth I might have once hoped for as a teenager confused by his growing distance, but toward something more honest than existed before, conversations that occasionally touch on his own shame and regret regarding Marcus, and gradually, an acknowledgement on his part of how his own guilt and secrecy likely contributed to the emotional distance he'd maintained from our entire family for years, without ever fully understanding or articulating its source, even to himself. Ethan and I married about a year after that first meeting with Marcus, a small ceremony where Marcus, at my invitation, stood alongside my closest friends, a detail that would have seemed entirely impossible to imagine just 2 years earlier, before that letter reframed everything I thought I understood about my own family. I think often about my mother's choice to carry this secret silently for so many years, weighing her own understanding of Gerald's failures against the practical necessity of maintaining stability for a teenage daughter who'd already lost one father and desperately needed the remaining stability our household could provide. I understand now, far more completely than I could have as a teenager or even a younger adult, how genuinely difficult that quiet protective strategy must have been for her to maintain for over a decade, secretly supporting a stepson she'd never even met in person, building a careful hidden relationship purely out of her own sense of what was right, entirely separate from whatever complicated feelings she must have carried toward Gerald himself once she'd discovered the truth about his abandonment. What Gerald never understood, not until Mr. Alvarez's voice filled that quiet office reading my mother's carefully preserved words, is that the secret he'd successfully kept for over 3 decades hadn't actually remained his alone at all. It had been discovered, quietly managed, and ultimately transformed into an act of genuine care by a woman who chose compassion for a child who wasn't even her own over the simpler, more immediately satisfying option of exposing her husband's failures the moment she discovered them. I never anticipated any kind of reckoning when I walked into that attorney's office that rainy Wednesday afternoon, genuinely uncertain what the meeting could possibly be about given how little Gerald and I had discussed anything of real substance in the years since my mother's passing. I only wanted to understand whatever truth she had felt necessary to preserve so carefully for so long, until circumstances finally called for its release into the open. In the end, that truth offered something I never could have anticipated, not simply a painful revelation about Gerald's past failures, but an entirely new relationship with a brother I never knew I had. One my mother had quietly, protectively made possible years before either of us ever knew the other existed. Some evenings, sitting with Ethan on our porch, I find myself thinking about how strange it is that grief, of all things, ended up handing me one of the most meaningful relationships of my adult life, a gift my mother clearly understood, even as she carried its full weight alone for so many years before finally letting it come to light. If your own family has ever revealed a hidden truth that reshaped your entire understanding of the people who raised you, I'd genuinely like to know. Did that revelation bring you closer to someone you never expected? Or did it simply confirm something you'd always sensed quietly beneath the surface, without ever having the proof needed to fully understand it until the truth finally, unavoidably came to light?